Hi.
How are you?
I'm
So
good.
I'm Philip Howard. I don't feeling like a bit of an introduction here, but I'm Philip Howard, and of course this is Steffani and Garrett. Um, I'm going to start with this, Garrett. I understand in our conversation before that this is the first time that you're actually seeing similitude. What was that like for you?
It was interesting. It was I think the moment that stuck out the most to me was like me and my sister Gabrielle, when we were like working in her apartment. It we when we were younger, we didn't get along at all. But now as we've gotten older, it's we can play around a lot more, and it just reminded me of like if we weren't fighting as kids, like how much fun we would have. Um, Other than that, just seeing my face so intensely and so um, was was really cool. Like going into this project, like I'm a mime, as some of you may know. Marceau, and Decroix are like idols, and so even like the thought of trying to attempt to mimic them is like almost sacrilege in the mime community unless you're like in school with them. Um, and so Mask Maker towards the end, when we were doing it, I was just like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? We're filming this. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. But seeing it, I feel really great about it. Just like I let myself go. Uh, and I feel like Steffani captured it really well. Yeah. Yeah. That's how I feel about it. I feel good about it. And
Thank goodness.
Yeah,
I
right.
feel good about it. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So Stephanie, I guess let's talk a little bit about that. I noticed that similitude plays a lot with inversion. Um, so I was looking at it as thinking about the mirror that never gives back what we really hold in front of it, really. Inverted images, the segment where Garrett's face is overlaid over itself, kind of thing. And all of them seem to speak to me to the way in which mimicry is always an inexact praxis. And it seems to push back against the demand for sameness and the ways that the black body is often considered unruly and therefore required to conform. We see a different objective for mimicry here. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking about in relation to this, if at all? Um, you know, yeah.
Sure, thank you. In many ways, maybe I'll begin to respond to your question first by just mentioning that the process of making sensus plenier and the process of making similitude, they were quite different. Sensus plenier emerged from an intensive period of conversation and research and recording a huge amount of footage, but I also had a pretty clear arc in mind when I developed the work and when I began to finish the work, where similitude in many ways, even watching it now, still feels very much like a kind of presentation, like an exploration, a series of experiments that unfolded with sort of with Garrett privately, with Garrett in public space, with Garrett and his sister, with relation to historical material, and that each of these instances offers an opportunity to examine different facets of the same, this kind of constellation. I certainly, you said mimicry is an inexact praxis. I certainly thought a lot about the kind of impossibility of perfect identification as I was creating the work. I also was thinking a lot about the experience of belatedness, what it means to feel like you come after, or what it means to come after, and what forms of improvisation can unfold in the interval. What it means to intentionally divert one's gestures or intentions or movements. I was also thinking a lot about the experiences of imitation that and the kinds of the forms of satisfaction, physically, socially, that unfold when we allow our bodies to coincide with others, and what it might mean to create space for that to happen, or create space to experiment with that.
That makes me think a lot about the whole practice of actually mimicking someone. I think we were talking about this a little bit before, Garrett, too.
Yeah, I think when I was watching the film, that moment when we were like in the park, and I was like, ooh, I'm not doing a very good job. But then I was like looking at it, and mimicking is such a hard thing to do. I found myself when I was actually there trying to mimic them, but there's like a delay on it automatically because you're not in their mind. You're not sure what they're going to do. But then also your point of view, trying to mimic the way they're looking. You can't look straight ahead. You have to look at them to understand what they're actually doing. So that lack of perfection, right. But then the search of it at the same time. Just
in the introduction, Robin used the word echo, and he and I have spoken before about echo as a formal tool. I think a lot about the ways in which formal devices like inversion or echo or delay or relay, the way that those kinds of formal devices have implications that are aesthetic, but also often ethical or political or social or historical, that they're not simply visual or sonic formal experiences, but are experiences that reflect deeper relationships, connections, and models for how we live in the world.
So what's it like mimicking people, Garrett? I feel like, let me go to what I've written here, because it's best to stick to my script. People are offering themselves up to be mimicked, right? When you do this work, and so they're also sort of performing themselves, right? They have to decide, well, what am I going to allow this guy to mimic and not? So what am I offering up, and what am I going to hold back? So I'm wondering what kinds of things you think about when you're doing that, in terms of how to take on that work respectfully, and in the end, the power dynamics that are set up between you and the person you're working with.
I think we were looking at going to Prospect Park. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with Brooklyn. We were looking at going to Prospect. And then Steffani switched it up, and we're like, we're going to, was it Bed-Stuy? Where'd we go? It's
called St. John's Park, in Crown Heights.
St. John's Park. And I was like, okay, we're going into Brooklyn. And so I got a little nervous, but as soon as we got there, people were like, okay, you're in a black unitard, so what are you doing? And but everybody was really welcoming and really receptive to it. But it was more so... we were looking around, seeing what people were doing, and what I do in that situation is I take in the person as a whole. I try and like make a connection with them at first. I'm like, hey, we're doing this project, try and feel what they're really like, and then after that, I let them walk away for 2 or 3 minutes, just watching them. And hopefully they kind of forget about me, give them enough time to forget about me. And then after that, it's just you take in the body. I start usually with the feet if I'm walking. I start with the feet, and hopefully they just don't take what I give as an insult. I feel like most people are just flattered that you pay attention to them. But yeah, physicality, I go from the feet, I go to the, and then work my way all the way up, go to the hips. But most of the time it's in the feet and the hips. The shoulders help a lot too. And then specificity in the fingertips. But yeah.
Wow. I love that connection that you're drawing between attention as opposed to, the mocking that's possible in mimicry. Sensus plenior. That was such an experience for me, I have to say. Steffani, thank you so much for that. Thank you for both. I just love that one. The church miming ministries that Sensus plenior is based on are almost always, at least in my experience, performed to gospel music with the lyrics that then inform how we're supposed to understand and read the movements that are happening. And as a matter of fact, I've often found that in those kinds of performance, there's a very one-to-one sort of intention with the actions. This means book kind of idea. But you take that away from us completely, at least in the beginning of Sensus plenior, and you draw our attention to all the other things that are happening. So I'm just interested in how you see these different modes of meaning making, right? On the one hand, this sort of, this movement represents this. And then when you just take that away completely, yeah.
Sure. So I had been thinking about working with mime ministry as a subject for a long time. A lot of my past work has explored two things. One, I've made a lot of work that has to do with the history of cinema, particularly the kind of earliest fiction films from the turn of the century. And then I've also made a lot of work that has to do with privacy and opacity as political choices. And so it made obvious sense for me to explore pantomime, the kind of history of pantomime at some point in my practice. I had been particularly interested in mime ministry for some years. My grandfather, I'm giving a really roundabout answer to your question, sorry, but my grandfather was a pastor of a very large church on the south side of Chicago, and so I grew up with a really particular relationship to the church, a relationship that I would describe as fairly textual, a pretty kind of discursive relationship, because he was a preacher, and I have these memories of him with a legal pad, on weekends, writing sermons, writing notes for sermons, and preparing this material that would ultimately be interpreted performatively. And he was very supportive of and very interested in the kind of broader expressive field that can accompany or that can be a part of a church service. And I think for him, he was on the one hand interested in extending and expanding the body-based learning, the body-based forms of communication and reception that can unfold in the church. And I think he was also really interested in finding ways of bringing new people into the fold. And of course, so all of that is to say that after he passed away, one of the kind of specifications in his funeral was that he wanted to have this specific mime minister minister at his funeral service, and I was really profoundly moved by that experience, and so I knew that I wanted to work with mime ministry at some point, and I knew that my relationship to it would have to do with some of the frictions that you're pointing toward regarding the relationship between language, interpretation, movement, maybe something like performance or theatricality and reception. And when I first began to work with Susan, I was interested in working with her in part because she's a sort of leader in the mime ministry community in New York City. She's self-published a book that I learned a lot from and reference a lot in my research around the kind of history of mime ministry, and also it's also sort of a practical primer to mime ministry. But she also has a very particular approach to her choreography. And when I began to work with her, I remember in one of our first conversations, I said, one of the things I don't understand about my ministry is that it feels so redundant. Why, given the expressiveness of gospel music, what do you think is the role of this excess that you're creating, this kind of physical excess that you're creating through the body? Like, what more can the body do that this music doesn't already do? Is there anything that this music can't do? What do you imagine? And she said, well, I see, this is an interpretive practice. It's a kind of hermeneutics, like a body-based hermeneutics. It's a way of using the body itself as a medium for expressing knowledge that's actually rooted in the body. And so she said, there are many ways to think about the relationship between language and the body, but for me, the body is the origin of language. Language comes from the body; it is inseparable from it, and so for me, she suggested the body is the kind of source, and also it's the kind of repository. It's a reserve. Meaning flows into it and through it, out of it into another body, into it and through it, and out of it into another body. And so she imagines this kind of space of reception that's required. So she rejected the word performance. Was offended when I used that word the first day. Never made that mistake again. She was not interested in thinking about this as a presentational practice, a practice that involved sort of entertaining or displaying her body to someone else, but rather thought of it as a kind of cyclical process that could only unfold when everyone was acting and receiving in a kind of cycle that for her reflected the form of I sometimes think of what Fred Moten and Stefano Harding have called study without end, the kind of form of study without end, the endlessly deferred and kind of endlessly renewing form of study that's required in order to kind of recommit oneself to. I mean, in her theology, to recommit oneself to the Spirit, to recommit oneself to Christ, and so this kind of openness that's required for endless study is specific, particularly what I was interested in, and so in examining then the choreography that she developed, I came to recognize that some of my assumptions weren't quite right. There is a relationship, for example, to American Sign Language for many mime ministers, I think, although many of them may not know American Sign Language. In the U.S., Black Americans, of course, use a vernacular sign language that's not the same as American Sign Language at all. So to the extent that there's a relationship, it often is more of an intuitive relationship, using a gesture that points to the body to refer to the self, and some of the other more kind of literal images. But one of the things that's interesting for Susan and many other mime ministers is that the system doesn't work as a language because it's not consistent from one song to another, although it might be consistent, relatively consistent sort of internally. And so she sees any song as an opportunity to build a vocabulary that can serve as like a whole world, a whole universe, a kind of movement universe that accompanies a particular a song. But then the song, of course, doesn't exist in isolation, but is performed in relation to a service at a particular time of year, in relation to maybe a particular theological moment or a particular sermon. And so all of these things are intentional, specific, can't be changed, and really, really meaningful, really important. So then the process of making the work, of course, becomes complicated because I'm working, I'm on a deadline. I had, we started working together maybe 6 months before I needed to finish shooting the work, but those are 6 months during which a very specific set of theological events unfold. And so, figuring out when I could, what the sort of range of possibilities were for this work, which I knew had to examine just a single sequence of gestures, and then figuring out like when that could happen, and realizing that it could never be repeated, and so I had to get it right the first time. All of that created a lot of pressure around the production process. But fortunately, working with actors who are involved in the church is often really rewarding, because they feel that the experience is like it's happening because it's supposed to happen, and there's a lot of faith in the process, which meant that we really trust each other. We're still close. We talk a lot, and I felt that I had to kind of rise to the occasion of her faith in me as an artist. That was a very long answer.
It was, and I enjoyed it so much because there's so much to think about in there. I mean, you mentioned Harney and Moulton and the undercommons, and the kind of learning that happens outside the frame and unintended. Like, I mean, I hear you speaking to that process. It sounds as though you came in and learned, not that you would take on a project and not expect to learn, but just that there was a whole sort of process for you there and an exchange between you and Susan Reverend Webb that was just ongoing and recursive, and the kind of learning they talk about there.
That's true. I would add to that I entered a place where learning was happening. I entered a site where learning was always unfolding, and
Mm-hmm.
And so I entered. I think of sometimes a kind of like a Deleuzian, like a stammer, like you go into the middle of something, and then you kind of like rattle around in there and see what's going on, figure out the edges, and try to. And kind of work within the logic of where you are. So, and I think, and I guess for me, obviously, because of the references that you just mentioned, finding anti-hierarchical models for understanding what it means to learn and to teach, kind of anti-hierarchical models, anti-teleological models also for understanding what learning is, that it's not a kind of accumulation of things that you just like hoard. Knowledge gets hoarded like pennies, and then you just like dole it out to your students. I'm a teacher also. But rather that it's a process is something that I think about a lot, and for me as a professor, actually, I think it's something that I'm constantly sort of recommitting myself to remembering and understanding the many places, the many places where practices of, I'll say learning as shorthand, but of understanding are unfolding that are not. That are not school, or that are not that don't participate in the hierarchies of either of the classroom, or I think for me as a Black American who thinks always about Christianity and literacy, these two frameworks that we've invoked in relation to master-slave dynamics, and I spoke earlier about belatedness as an experience that I reflect on, and I'm always thinking about. I don't know. I could say evading. I could say circumventing, or I don't know. That I'm always kind of thinking around and outside and through, and the way that I think about what it means to understand, what it means to learn, is I situate within that kind of larger project, historical project, cultural project, and I mean, obviously, it's central to my own work.
Wow. It sounds like it would be fascinating to be in your classroom. As a teacher myself in the university, I kind of, it's something that I always have to come back to and think about, right? And just their notion of, as you say, not thinking about knowledge of accumulating stuff, but even the process of accumulating debt, is as a way of learning and a way of not ever being able to reciprocate is fascinating. Sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, just to add to that, I teach at a public university in the U.S. Like all universities, but more than private universities, the education is subsidized to some degree by the state. But I think it's interesting because I've taught in so many schools. I was kind of an adjunct for many years before I started teaching full time at Rutgers, and I remember that faculty would often complain that it felt in the U.S. as though there was a kind of service provider model to education, that students had an expectation that they approached it, their experience in the classroom kind of transactionally. And I always thought, but of course, why wouldn't they, given the structure, economically the structure of the education system, and who, it's so complicated and difficult to pretend. It takes this extraordinary kind of mental acrobatics, to me, from my perspective, for a faculty member to pretend like those are not the conditions under which learning is happening, and to pretend as though there's something that the students are doing wrong, when the students are actually just participating in the system as it's laid out for them. And it's actually faculty who have this extraordinary imaginative capacity to pretend as though we're learning for learning's sake is something that's available to those students who are accumulating debt as they study, or something that's that's possible for us, when of course that's not the case for us either as faculty.
Yeah. So much there. Yeah. I'm going to bounce back to Garrett for a minute. The black body.
Okay.
Performance scholars have always argued that the black body is always in performance, right? Not only because blackness, of course, like any other identity, is a performance. Like it's really about what we do, right? It's not something sort of ingrained, but also because black people's bodies and our actions in the day-to-day are so frequently taken up as spectacle, despite ourselves, right? So we can be just going about our business and folks are just like, it's just. So as a black performance artist, how, if at all, does that kind of thinking affect your practice? Like how, do you find yourself being taken up in ways that you had no intention and are actually not necessarily pleased with?
Well, I guess as a black man, as a black queer man, I've lived in New York for 5 years, and I lived in Ridgewood, and I lived in Bushwick and Harlem. I recently lived in Harlem. And I feel like the times that I am most seen, or not seen, but like noticed as a black man is in Harlem, or sometimes like that performance for people that look like me. That thought of, am I black enough, or am I presenting as black, or am I presenting as non-black? But as an artist, that does happen from time to time. As a mime, it's a very white art form. It started in Europe. No, I'll take that back. It started at the beginning of theater, so probably started in Egypt. But it's been it's moved on into Europe and into America. So when I got into the art form, I wanted to do clowning, and then I found mime in New York, And just, there's an awareness that I am stepping into an art form that isn't necessarily, I'm not perceived to be in that art form. And I kind of think of it as sometimes ballerinas feel that, or black ballerinas feel that in spaces where their hair might not fit into a tight bun, or the shoes aren't nude in their skin. And I mean, I studied at the American Mime Theater, which was founded in 1954 by Paul J. Curtis after he studied with LaCroix. Decroix. And there's always that feeling of being a little out of place. Does your body doesn't look like all of the bodies around you, so you stick out. And there is a bit of performance in that. But I went into the art form as an actor to get more into my body and less in my mind, because sometimes your mind will play tricks on you and you can't depend on it every time you walk onto a set or every time you walk into a theater. So you have to find other tools to that you can rely on in times where your other tools fail you. But yeah, performing.
And I mean, when Garrett and I met, we talked a lot about the genealogies for his own practice in physical theater, and the ways in which physical theater was appealing precisely because it seemed to offer an opportunity to think in a really intentional way about the use and the deployment of the body,
right.
And but then that paradoxically the kind of forms of physical theater that were within which training was available,
art, mime, and clowning,
right, felt his body felt like it didn't fit, and then I in our second meeting, which was kind of a screen test to imagine what it would be like to work together on a video, and we were also preparing a performance, a version of which we'll be sharing tomorrow. Garrett shared a mime and drama that he created himself, that was entirely centered around the American flag. The American flag as a kind of absent prop.
Yeah, and I grew up in a military background with my dad. He's Air Force, and it's always been like the whole kneeling at football games. It's a complicated situation for me because freedom is what like you ask any military person if kneeling is a bad thing, and they'll be like, well, I fought for them to be able to do whatever they want to at a football game. And so that was going around in my head, and I was like, what if I just like knelt and burnt an American flag? How can I do that? But with mime, you can do that, and you can step on toes, but you're not really stepping on toes because you're not really burning a flag. So it was just like ways to express myself, a way to express myself without any barriers or words to hold me back. That's why I've always enjoyed it.
I'm going to say one other thing, that the is the curatorial fellow who wrote the questions here. Hi. And what's your name again? Ashley, yes. So Ashley, so when Ashley sent the interview questions, she asked about the forms, the form that I chose for these different works, including the performance tomorrow, which is kind of a lecture performance, and one of the questions was, well, what's appealing about the lecture performance or a kind of discursive performance in relation to in relation to your work or in relation to Black culture, Black expression in general. And I remember when I read that question thinking it was so interesting because she could have just as easily asked that question about mime. It was so interesting to me that it was a question that unfolded about the lecture. And I was thinking a lot about, both the lecture and pantomime as in different ways, forms that, well, I was thinking about I'll just say the kind of complexity of in the way that we think about the relationship between a form or the process of formation or forming with relation to the body, with relation to ideas, with relation to expression, which I'll put in quotes, with relation to research, it's something that has been on my mind ever since, actually.
And then I think one of the interesting ways that we think about Blackness currently is about that not quite fitting, but what happens when we expand the definition or the conception of what we're doing to include us, right? Because we're usually not included in any conception of anything, of community, of performance, of what it means to be a dancer or a mime or so on, and so to actually redraw the boundaries so that we're a part of that and we're in it in some way transforms it radically. What thoughts do either of you have about how that might work for you in your practices?
For me, I'll start.
Mm-hmm.
Garrett, thanks. For me, I will say that for me, this as a problem is very clear. That one of the challenges and one of my goals as an artist is to imagine new genealogies for the forms that I inhabit. And so, for example, what was so important to me about my ministry is that it existed entirely independently. It's a kind of vernacular practice that has its own rules, its own conventions, its own history, traces its lineage to West Africa, and to the very history of, to the kind of origin of theater, and one that rejects traditional conventions of performance, rejects theatricality, and offers then another way into thinking about what it means to move and what it means to be moved that have nothing to do with any of those frameworks. Doing the work to uncover, inhabit, and use these forms is critical. Is critical in the way that I understand my practice, and it's commitment that is present in a kind of wide in all of my work, not just my work with movement, not just my work in video, which has also been deeply invested in sort of re-examining and finding new genealogies and new roots to the place where we are now, but also in my work with drawing, which has been heavily invested in finding genealogies to drawing and genealogies to writing that do not move through the kind of heroic narrative through which that was so prominent in the U.S. and during the kind of white-led abolition movement that involved creating these sort of superhero slaves who learn how to read from masters and are therefore then all of a sudden inaugurated into this space of interiority and the possibility of political agency. None of those things have to be connected to me. So, yes, all of that is to say that these are things that I think about a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think just it's fascinating to me the way that you refer to your practice as ministry to begin with. That I think is quite a radical move.
Well, I don't refer to my practice as ministry, I refer.
I'm hearing you use it to you say, oh, okay, maybe I'm misunderstanding you between my ministry and my ministry. That's probably what's happening.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
okay.
No, I don't want to, appropriate a context from the church. Although I wish I do look outside of the vocabularies that I've inherited. Are I would say art historically for language that I can but also for models that I can use to describe the work, the practice. Yes.
Yeah, interesting slip of language for me there. Yeah. Garrett, you were gonna say?
Yeah, I was gonna say when it comes to mime, as an actor, you're always in search for freedom in your work, and ways to convey that freedom to other people. And I feel mime was one of the first art forms where I felt completely free, like you're not really thinking about very much. And I've performed for younger Black kids and older Black audiences as well. And it's not something that they see very often except for in the mime ministry. And if they go to a Black Southern church, or I guess Philly too. So, but it's in gaining my own freedom and showing that, I believe that's what I look for to help my culture out. Yeah, that's what I like to.
So you end up breaking some of the conventions too.
We can do whatever we want to do.
Yeah.
We can do whatever we want to do.
Thanks. I don't know how we're doing for time, but if we had for one more, or sure. I'm really fascinated in Sensus Plenior, with your decision to include the minister who introduces Reverend Webb in the whole frame, the whole time. And I'm intrigued about how that person is moving as well. It's totally a different type of performance, but it speaks to the sort of recursive, accepted, understood ways that Black people's bodies move in that particular setting. So I'm thinking particularly of the moment where we see her. Did her phone ring in the midst? Did she silence that?
I think she silenced it.
Yeah, but right after that, she sort of does this, and that's just so meaningful, right? Like, for in a Black church that would be, and then she stands and crosses the arms, and that is just totally. So I'm just thinking about that whole vocabulary of movement as well, and you've juxtaposed it against what Reverend Webb is doing, and then there's also she's on the actual stage, whereas Reverend Webb is in front of it, creating her own stage, and I'm just thinking of all these different levels of complexity here, and I just want to hear more about how you were thinking about all of that as you put it together.
I love that moment and that activity too. I think since when I started working with pantomime as a subject, I began to think about ways of creating. I've never actually had to articulate this, so excuse me if it's a little bit awkward. But I had to think about the role of the camera with relation to the subject, and ways of splitting the gaze in order to reflect this experience of this kind of experience of two-ness, the doubleness, the doubling that is that's like a constitutive part of pantomime. And so and you see in similitude as well that there's this focus on, there's a kind of triangulation that's especially that sometimes involves a relationship between Garrett and another actor and me, or Garrett, another actor, the camera. But it actually forced me to think about the camera in a really different way. And that shot in particular, because it's like it's fully frontal. Susan is facing me directly. It was important to triangulate that. I wanted to have another gaze on Susan, to model the splitting that I see as such an important and complicated part of the kind of examination of pantomime socially, as well as in relation to a kind of understanding of the self. So that's why one reason why I chose to present this work, this song, Anointing, at this church, because that was the setup at that church, which I thought would be really ideal for my shot. Susan actually ministers at 2 churches, so I had a few options that I was considering, and this church, because of this kind of circular, because of the circular setup, and because of the position of a single minister in the background, it created an ideal triangulating situation. I don't know. It was kind of an intuitive. I mean, these are kind of intuitive decisions. I knew that I needed that person who was looking at Susan to be in the frame, but I don't know. It's a little bit difficult for me to explain why. But I do think, in relation to what you're saying about that figure's movement, having someone else who helps to mark the passage of time was also something that I knew would be important, given the way that time is really expanded, and the way that movement is really expanded, in that, and gesture is expanded. It's the same reason that it was important for Susan to be talking during the second section in which she's putting on makeup, right. So that I don't know. It felt so clear at the time, but it felt necessary as a way to create an awareness of a kind of simultaneity of different experiences. In that case, different experiences of meaning making or language that are unfolding, or and I think about those things in relation to mark making. Also, I talked about drawing and writing, but and so to have these marks that are accompanied by these sounds, which sound almost textual, they sound almost verbal, and as well as musical, and then to have her speak at a certain point in order to expand, to create this kind of expanded space of meaning, production, gesture, was really necessary, and so it produced a kind of friction in the same way as having Reverend Rieberg sitting and then standing and then crossing her arms.
Fascinating. Robin, I don't know where you want to go from here, but I just really want to thank you both, and for the invitation from Robin as well, for the opportunity to really sit with your work and spend time with it and so on. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was wondering, actually, the question is for Steffani. I was wondering if you decided on the sets that you were about to shoot on beforehand, or it was organic in the way of you didn't choose really the set. You talked about actually you chose the set of the church, but every scene, every shot was in specific surroundings, and I was wondering if it had some kind of connection with what you were expressing in the films.
In both works, or just in Sensus Plenier?
In Sensus Plenier, mostly.
I think what I would say is that, so as I mentioned at the very beginning, that was a work that I developed over a period of time, but it's very minimal. There are relatively few discrete elements, and so I had a lot of time to plan each of those individually. And so initially I think I knew that I was interested in, I knew that I wanted to have a rehearsal experience and a getting ready experience and a ministry experience, and that I wanted them maybe to unfold in a traditional order, but that maybe our expectations about time might be upended. That was all I knew when I started, and so I was able to spend a lot of time in the different places where Susan rehearsed, for example, and make a decision that her home with this text in the background would be a really perfect frame. She also has, I don't think we have any of this here, but there's a catalog accompanying Sensus Plenier, and in the catalog there are some photos that I took in her home. She's a little bit post. She actually always laments this fact, speaking of belatedness, that she's a little bit post, like, Black Power as a movement, as a period, but was deeply influenced and spoke about wishing that she'd been born half a generation earlier. And so she has this Africa tattoo on her arm, which you can see in some images. She has photographs of, I don't know, moments in the history of the Black Power movement. That material is really interesting too, although I ultimately wasn't able to include it. I don't know, roundabout answer to your question. Yes, each of them was thought through. And planned pretty carefully, compositionally. I worked also with a cinematographer, so there were 2 cameras for a lot of Sensus Plenier, although I didn't always use both of them, just in some of the material at Susan's house. But so because of that, I had to be super, it had to be very planned, and also because of the fact that most of it could only happen once. Yes, each of those details was really planned. Is that your question? Yeah, in terms of the environment, but also I think I guess just to add one other thing. Of course, given how much time we spend in each of those locations, the details are important, not only because they're potentially meaningful, but also because they, your gaze begins to wander. If you're staring forever at, the same space, then you start to look at all of the other things that are going on in the room. And so it makes the room really critical. I don't feel like I'm that short. In fact, I recently found out that I'm 5'3.5", which I understand is an average height, but my feet don't touch the ground in these chairs.
I have a question about sound and music, and I guess in this idea of a cyclical process, how did was the music responsive, or was it discursive? Like, was it iterative with the image and with the movement?
In which work?
Both. With both. I thought the music was a huge part of the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the music is the work as much as the images are the work for both of these works. I don't want to ramble, but I don't, because people don't ask about sound that much, I don't have like a very canned answer, so feel free to rein it in if it gets long. For Sensus Plenier, I knew that I wanted to, it was important to abstract the language that was present in that was associated with the gestures that Susan was performing, or that Susan was doing. And so I knew that the song itself wouldn't be presented. And I also was interested in creating a kind of mild historical relationship, both with early cinema and also I was thinking about some of the kind of Western art music contexts that have sometimes accompanied silent film at various in various historical moments. So that was already on my mind. I invited two musicians who's they're both musicians of color, people that I know and have worked with before, to come into the studio to record with me. And the bassist was primarily responding to the edited video, which I had already finished at that point, and drawing from I asked him to, we established certain kind of melodic, harmonic frameworks because I knew how it was going to interact with the violin, and so I wanted to stay in a certain kind of space, and so we recorded, and then I actually edited it a lot. It sounds continuous, but it's actually fully kind of reorganized in order to accomplish what I wanted. And the violinist, an amazing violinist named Maz Swift, we talked a lot about the range of musical references that were present for her, actually for Maz, and also listened to the song, listened to J. Moss's Anointing, and developed musical material from that. And again, it was heavily edited. And then I worked with a musical producer. This was the second time I'd worked with this person. The first time I'd worked with him on a video. This is a guy who makes like remixes of club songs. and I worked with him both on some of the effects that are involved in the first part, and then really heavily on the ministry section, the kind of abstracting of the J. Moss song. For Similitude, the short answer is, so when I started, by the time I started filming Similitude, I knew that Marcel Marceau's The Mask Maker would play a really important role as inspiration. I didn't know how important it would be in the final work. I wasn't sure to what degree it would be present visually, but it was really important in the work that Garrett and I did as we were rehearsing and developing our work together. And so I decided, I was researching the song that accompanies the filmed version of The Mask Maker, and learned that it's attributed to Vivaldi, but is actually considered to be a copy, like an imitation in the style of Vivaldi, although it's typically still attributed to him, but that there's some questions about its authorship. And I was really interested in that, and decided to work with a group of 4 musicians to interpret the material. And so what you hear in the soundtrack is those 4 musicians who are sometimes actually playing the sheet music, which it turned out they're all like free improvising jazz musicians and couldn't really play sheet music. And that caused a lot of like tension and anxiety, which was really productive for me, generative. And sometimes they're improvising. They all recorded separately, so a lot of the material again is really is edited and recomposed into new compositions that make it sound like they're in the same room. There's a kind of theme and variations exploration with the Vivaldi material that then you hear a little bit the soundtrack at the very end of the work, the Marceau soundtrack. I'll say, I mentioned earlier that Similitude, that it unfolded in a kind of essayistic way. For me, the process of constructing it, and I think a little bit that's still present in how it's organized. And so I wanted the music to create a space that was very safe and kind of relaxing, lulling almost for the viewer, and that it also would create a sense of the meandering, like the kind of moving around that was happening visually, that it could hold everything together coherently, but also that it would give people permission to have a little bit of wandering and flexibility themselves as they're experiencing the work. I think a lot of what I wanted a lot of the experience that I wanted to create in both sensus plenior and similitude. It's affective. I want it to act upon you, to remind you of things that you've experienced, to invite you to imagine the kind of possibilities and limits of identification, and that requires a certain amount of patience and generosity, of course, from the viewer. But I also was trying to think about ways of creating a safe place for that to happen, and the long, the relying on really long takes was a part of it, and there are other tools, but then sound was another part, and I was very lucky to work with just incredible musicians. 4 different musicians: a cellist, Lester St. I'm not going to remember all of their names. I shouldn't start listing them. Okay, a cellist, Lester St. Louis, a horn player, reed player, Sam Newsom, and 2 pianists, Alexis Marcello and David Varelis. Yeah, David Varelis was like the jazz pianist who was playing during when we first are in the park. Yeah, the kind of virtuosic. He was like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "Can you do it a little like less good?" He was like, "I can't." And the second pianist was playing Rhodes a lot, and he was also the guy that was playing during the Mass Maker. He was playing the strings, like plucking the strings of the piano, and then the cellist was obvious. And I did a lot of work putting Rhodes and reed together, or piano and reeds together. Did that answer is that the kind of question? Okay. Sometimes people, I don't know, I ramble, so.
I have a question around the camera's very close. I find like there's no, in fact, there isn't a lot for your eye to wander elsewhere. In the 2, especially in sensus plenior, but also in similitude. And I'm wondering, at the end of sensus plenior, I mean, in a sense, it rivets the gaze. And yes, when we're looking at her miming gospel, we do wander around, but not that much because she's so riveting. And in similitude, the camera's very close to Garrett, even when he's following in the park and sitting on the stairs mimicking. But in the end of those 2 videos, in sensus plenior, there's a cut. It's not a camera, it's a cut, right? Where you see the space in which you are. Like before we're looking at her with that stage at the back where the other minister's sitting. And then we see a kind of small slice of her sitting there, and also of one person, another person shows up, that appears. It's ambiguous. What I'm trying to get at is reception and audience, and there we get a little slice of it, but it's very ambiguous in terms of audience there. Whether it's an audience or observers or people that were there throughout. And in similitude, at the end, we shift to color, which is very striking, right? And maybe you could comment on the use of color, which changes the space completely. And then there's a sound. The sound there is a different sound. I mean, as far as I can remember, this is the first sound that sounds kind of human to me, where it seems like clapping, right? Is it clapping? Yeah, and it's clapping kind of out of control. So it's disturbing, in fact. So there's something about reception and audience that's ambiguous there. I don't know what kind, that's my that's my comment, yeah.
Okay. It's funny because we were talking about audience before, before we started, and talking about what happens when work interpolates different audiences differently when it reaches different audiences differently, and also I think a lot. I'll say that in the for both of these works, something like audience, like who's watching, isn't something that I take for granted, and it's one reason that I took opportunities to draw attention to the camera in different ways, and to draw attention to the activity of framing, the activity of composing an image, because it wasn't intended to be neutral, and we were not intended to be kind of seeing through it. And I also didn't want viewers to feel either as though they were voyeurs in a space that they're not supposed to be, or as though they're particularly privileged, like that they have access to something that they shouldn't, or that they but it was also important that it not feel like a clinical look. And so there were a lot of there was a lot that I was trying to kind of carefully move through, decisions that I was trying to make carefully. I think with Sensus Plenier, I can tell you on a practical level, we was shot during a service. That was the ministry of that song during the service, and everything that you saw was related to that specific ministry. So we saw her getting ready for that event, and then we saw her recovering afterward. It was important for me not to expose the community of witnesses, participants in this experience, to the kind of random, hungry gaze of art viewers, many of whom have never been in a Black church for good reason. And so it was important to create a kind of respectful privacy around the experience, while also making it possible for the viewer, for the witness, to understand that this wasn't staged specifically for the camera. And I don't know, maybe that to some degree that happens, but of course it's also possible to not be clear, which is okay. I think there's some, earlier we were talking about the fact that you recognized, for example, immediately and know the song "Anointing" by Jemison very well. So it's a pretty well-known pop gospel song, like a contemporary gospel song. It's part of contemporary gospel. It's not a Negro spiritual. It's not a historical gospel song, and yet it circulates really widely. And so I think there are so many ways in which different in different ways the work connects or invites or nods, winks to different audiences. In relation to similitude and the sound, so the sound, that's the soundtrack actually for the filmed performance of The Mask Maker that I mentioned earlier, which for those of you who see the performance tomorrow, you'll see it, and you'll see some aspect of that part of the work, of the video being unfolding live. The clapping, like the kind of almost grotesque experience of the clapping, it feels sometimes it's this question: is it mocking? Is it sympathetic? What is exactly is the relationship between the audience and this performer or the actor? That space was something that I felt was sort of maybe in the background a little bit, but that I was suspending for the during the entire first part of the video, that we never have an opportunity to really to make fun or to think ha ha ha, or this is weird or this is funny. You're just kind of in it, and it's really beautiful also, and so it's easy to kind of be seduced by some aspects of it. And then I wanted to create an experience. I wanted to create the possibility of alienation, of reflection on that aspect of what was happening, which is why I chose to include the sound from the film. Does that answer? Yeah.
Hi. First, I just want to say thank you for all of this today. My question is kind of about the memorialization of gesture for both of you. Just kind of your relationship to some kind of commemoration of gesture. And it's funny, I thought of GIFs a lot looking at both pieces, but obviously Sensus Plenier more. And there's an artist actually in Toronto, Sammy Rawal. He does a lot of, or he kind of designs these very specific gestural GIFs with mostly queer artists of color. And but he works as a commercial music video director. But this is kind of like a side project that he did, and I was reminded of his work in moments and just curious about each of your kind of relationship to this idea, and if that came into the work consciously or if it was more something that you see when you look after on the screen, because it is also kind of a screen-based association.
I think as I feel like I keep saying that. It's you learn specific gestures when you start, and it's kind of the retelling of that story over and over again, because mimes are very they have their own groups, and they're very protective of what it means of what it is to be a mime, almost to a point to where sometimes the black church would not be considered mime, and the black church would not be considered actual mime. So I think it's a constant memorialization of gesture. It's written in the bylaws. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I do these activities of like creating gesture-based gifts, for example, or rituals as gifts with my students in class. In fact, we did an activity like that last week.
Oh yeah, like gifts. You create gifts in class.
Yeah,
okay.
Movement-based gifts.
Yeah.
So I mean, I am very familiar with what you're describing, although I'm not familiar with the artist whose practice you're describing. I think
he just came to mind because he's, interested in screen-based but very specific movement gifts as well, but it's not so much maybe relevant to the answer.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting with movement because it's only alive at the moment that it's unfolding, which is not so different from any other time-based medium. I think we could say something similar about a book or something similar about a film. But in the case of movement, there's actually always that we don't have the reliable knowledge that we'll be able to return to the thing. And so the idea that the memory or knowledge, that there's some kind of knowledge or forms of knowing, activities of knowing that live in the body and are passed from a body to another body or shared or contaminated. I think a lot also about part of the ideology of education that has been so important in European and European influenced contexts has involved this relationship between volition and education, which is so weird to me. Like the idea that you learn something because you want to learn it, and if you don't learn it, it's because you didn't want to, and then things because you want to know them, and you don't know things because you're not trying or you don't want it. When actually, of course, most of what we know. And most of the kind of forms of knowing that are active and activated in us all the time are happen involuntarily, are happening, as you're listening to me, and maybe you're absorbing something about, I don't know, maybe there's some vocabulary that I'm using that will find its way into the way that you talk about movement, or maybe you're just absorbing something about me personally. Oh, she keeps doing this. Why? Those are these. I think a lot about non-volitional models for understanding ways that ideas and stuff get from one person to another. Like we're infected, or we're contaminated, or we absorb ideas one to the other. So I think gifts, it's a little bit complicated because on the of course, the idea of generosity is something that all of us are very interested in and looking for socially, culturally, these days. And it's really important to recommit ourselves to creating spaces and finding spaces for generosity. And then at the same time, I also am really interested in ways in which what is shared and what is received is not always is not always intentional, not always volitional, or like not always designed. And I also think a lot about forms, ways of knowing that live in the body and are kind of waiting to be activated, or waiting to be, they can never be captured. They can only be, space can be created for them to unfold, and what it means to make that room, and what it means to make that room also in, for me as an artist in my practice. I mean, I make other kinds of work that don't have the same kind of relationship to, I don't know what you would call this, but there's a connection to portraiture. There's a way in which it's like a deep dialogue with someone else's practice, which is like a very particular way of working. But for me, it's one of the hardest but most rewarding ways of thinking about what it is to create that kind of space for an encounter.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the handshake portion, when we're doing like the daps in on Similitude.
In the video, in the performance.
In the performance, I think that's like a memorialization of hand gestures in the Black community, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, but it's again, it's like calling it to mind. You'll see when you come to tomorrow's performance, and then we can continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Cool. Thank you. Thank y'all for staying with us.